So the first speaker is Stephennie Mulder, who's an associate professor in the Department of Art and Art History and in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She has her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and MA from Princeton. She's also, in addition to her work in the department at Texas, been the archaeological ceramicist on the Princeton University dig at Balas in Syria. She's published a book, The Shrines of the Alids in Medieval Syria, Sunnis, Shi'is, and the Architecture of Coexistence, with Edinburgh Press in 2014, which won the award from the World Prize for Book of the Year from the Islamic Republic of Iran in 2015, and was an ALA Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic Title in that same year, and the Syrian Studies Association Book Prize winner in that same year. She's also been the editor of a special issue of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture, Imagining Localities of Antiquity in Islamic Societies, which she is planning to turn into a collected volume. And in progress, she has a 2-volume analytical study of ceramic materials from that Princeton dig at Balas in Syria. Just to give a brief selection of titles of articles: Bishu's Laugh, The Arts of Satire in the Syrian Uprising, Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication, June 2018, and A Survey and Typology of Islamic Molded Ware, 9th to 13th Centuries, based on the discovery of a potter's workshop at medieval Balas in Syria. And so it's my pleasure to invite Stephennie to come to the podium, and her title is The Wisdom in Ruins, Veneration of the Material Past in the Medieval Islamic World.
Thank you, Peter and Abby, and everyone who worked so hard to organize this conference. Laura, are you back there somewhere, Laura? I know how much work goes into putting something like this together. It's an honor to be here, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see this topic getting more close attention. And I think these two opening presentations kind of set the stage for a lot of what will unfold over the course of the next couple of days. This question of whether there is Islamic antiquarianism, I think, is something we're all going to be delving into. I think it's important also to situate ourselves in the present because, of course, the current situation of people's perception of the Islamic world's understanding of the past as one that has been deeply damaged by ISIS in particular, but also a series of other Islamic engagements with the past over the course of the last decade. And so that's part of what I'm going to be doing today. And since I'm the first, in the unenviable position of being the first person to speak here, I'm going to be laying out some of the findings from my IJIA, International Journal of Islamic Architecture, edited. Well, it will be an edited volume. Was initially a special issue of that journal published in 2017, in which Peter and Abby so kindly referenced, because I think that. As a kind of beginning gesture, it's helpful to have a kind of typology for all of us to begin thinking through. This is certainly a work in progress, and I'm also engaged actually in a work in progress literally on this question. So I'll be very happy if this typology is modified over the course of the next few days. Following the advent of the Syria conflict, it has become commonplace for outsiders to assume that ISIS's apocalyptic destruction of the pre-Islamic past was somehow normative, that it represented, as they claimed, and as many popular media outlets reported, some form of, quote, Islamic relationship to ancient cities, sites, and cultural heritage localities. Indeed, assertions about the attitudes of Muslims and idolatry were widespread in popular media accounts of the destruction of ancient sites during the period of ISIS's ascendancy. But in reality, long before the emergence of ISIS and other so-called Islamist ideologues, even perhaps as early as the rise of Islam itself, Muslims imagined pre-Islamic antiquity in myriad ways, as sites of memory, as spaces of healing, or as places imbued with didactic, historical, and moral power. Within cities, Ancient statuary and reliefs were deployed as talismans. Paintings were interpreted to foretell and reify the coming of Islam, and temples of ancient gods and churches devoted to Christian saints were converted in ways that preserved their original meaning and sometimes even their architectural ornament and fabric. In this paper, I aim to begin to sketch out a typology of antiquarian concerns in the Islamic world. And I'd like to look at the role that the memory, in other words, the idea or the imagining of antiquity played and continues to play from the rise of Islam onward. Unlike the dark vision formulated by ISIS, this Islamic imagining of antiquity, much like the imagining of antiquity in Western Europe, was almost always a positive one, and it was one that was shared across time and space in the Islamic world. Indeed, it would not be wrong to say that with the exception of the ISIS moment, and perhaps the decade that preceded it in some quarters, this positive formulation of the value of antiquity has historically been the dominant formulation in Islamic societies. So what sort of places were these ancient sites, and how were and are they experienced by Muslims? What role did they play in urban development? Often, ancient localities are valued simply as places that elicited a sense of awe and wonder, or of reflection on the present relevance of history and the greatness of past empires. This theme was so prevalent that it created distinct and well-known genres of Arabic literature, ajaib, fada'il. In the east, sites like Ctesiphon, the ancient capital of the Sasanians, or closer to the Mediterranean, the Temple Mount, where the Jewish temple stood and where the Dome of the Rock was later built, were not rejected or destroyed after the coming of Islam. Instead, they were embraced by early companions and successors of the Prophet Muhammad and actively incorporated into the Islamic vision of the self. Furthermore, various Islamic interpretive communities, including Sunnis and Shias, as well as Jews and Christians, often shared holy spaces associated with antiquity and had similar haptic, sensorial, and ritual connections that enabled them to imagine antiquity in similar ways. Today, I'd like to explore the idea of the creation of a distinctly Islamic notion of heritage, a notion that is often based in cities that bore the traces of antiquity. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that this Islamic notion of heritage and the value of antiquity was a key reason for the continued occupation of ancient urban sites. One of the most prominent ancient sites in the Islamic world is Palmyra. And since Palmyra also played such a crucial role in the creation of the current popular perception of Muslims' relationship to the past, it seems a useful place to begin. By now, we're all familiar with the tragic story of the destruction by ISIS of the temples, Triumphal Arch, and tomb towers at Palmyra. Indeed, among the countless tragic spectacles of human and heritage violence to emerge from the Syrian conflict, few events focused the attention of the world like the conquest of the city of Palmyra by the so-called Islamic State exactly 4 years ago, in May of 2015. Palmyra, an ancient city on the Syrian desert that grew prosperous on trade in the 3rd century CE, is one of the most notable and visually magnificent sites of standing ruins from antiquity anywhere, and is Syria's most famous archaeological site. As ISIS moved into the area around the ancient city, news reports breathlessly followed the advance of the militia. Desperate accounts of hurried evacuations of both local residents and archaeological objects issued from the city, culminating in terrified dispatches from museum workers, many of whom spent the night in the museum in an attempt to safeguard the objects. One of these was the director of Palmyra for some 40 years, Dr. Khalid al-Assad, a venerable academic specialist on Palmyra. His shocking murder later in the summer of 2015 would again bring the ancient city into the headlines and underscore the dangers faced by Syrian archaeologists, many of whom, like Dr. Al-Assad, had been working heroically to protect museums and archaeological sites from the beginning of the conflict. As the crisis unfolded, the media narrative came to be dominated by a dialectic of civilized versus barbaric encounters with antiquity, and ISIS came to embody, in the popular imagination, something prototypically Islamic about the relationship of the world's Muslims to the material past. This popular notion was reinforced by a pattern of uncritical media repetition of ISIS' own explanations for their actions. Yet these same media accounts paid little attention to the simple question of how the monuments in question had survived more than 1,400 years of Islamic rule before the arrival of ISIS. And so, a Western narrative about the inevitability of Islamic iconoclasm, first established after the Taliban's destruction of the Bamyan Buddhas in 2004, further developed during the Danish cartoon controversy in 2005, and reinforced by the Charlie Hebdo massacre in 2015, came to bear on sites of antiquity as well. The previous story is by now fairly well known. But hidden within the monumental embrace of the Temple of Bel's fortified temenos is another history of destruction, though the tale is rarely told that way. This is the story of the French creation of Palmyra as a modern heritage locale, and it took place nearly a century prior to ISIS's performative encounter with the site, and it is one that can tell us a great deal about how Muslims valued the material past. Here, instead of adherents to a fringe sect of Islam, the protagonists are the well-intentioned, well-educated, and highly cultivated members of the French Antiquities Service, established in 1920. Their object was ostensibly noble: the restoration of Palmyra to its ancient state and the conservation and preservation of the site. Beginning in 1929, French archaeologists, under the direction of Henri Seyrig, laid out an ambitious program of restoration that included the consolidation of the site and of the interior cella of the famous temple dedicated to the ancient triad of deities worshipped at Palmyra. They also strengthened the entrance portal to the temple with reinforced concrete. No doubt one reason it still stands as the sole remnant of the now lost temple, today soaring forlornly above the shattered ashlar blocks that are all that remain after ISIS's act of destruction. But the story that is less frequently told is that in order to preserve, the Antiquities Service had to destroy. For when the French arrived on the scene in 1929, the site of Palmyra and the vast temenos surrounding the Temple of Bel was no long abandoned, empty ruin, but a living town, Tadmor, a site of near continuous habitation since antiquity. It still bore the name the inhabitants of the ancient city had used before it was rechristened Palmyra, after its Roman name, by the first European visitors in the 18th century. In fact, after the Roman period, in the era of Byzantine Christian and later Muslim rule, the city of Tadmor flourished, continuing its ancient legacy as a caravan city. Beginning in the Christian era, the city that had grown up inside the site of the vast ancient temple platform that extended around the Temple of Bel formed a living town, exactly on the pattern of other cities throughout the Middle East, including Damascus and Aleppo. Also like at Damascus, the ancient temple at the heart of the city was not destroyed, nor was it torn down or replaced. Instead, the Christian inhabitants of the town simply converted the ancient Temple of Bel, one of the largest temples in the Roman Empire, into a monumental Byzantine church. Indeed, prior to its destruction by ISIS, one could still see traces of the paintings of saints and martyrs that once graced the interior walls of the temple. Following the conquest of the city by the Muslims in 634, and again adhering to a pattern seen elsewhere in Syria, rather than destroying the church in an act of zealous iconoclasm or tearing it down to rebuild, the Umayyad governors chose to simply reuse the magnificent temple church by converting it into a mosque. Around the temple, the town continued to flourish, with major infrastructure projects like the construction of a souk or market to showcase the wares of the still vibrant silk route trade that passed through the city just as it had in antiquity. In later years, the town continued to thrive as one of the main stopping points on the Syrian desert trade route. In the Crusader era, in the early 12th century, the Burid governor Yusuf ibn Firuz built fortifications for the town surrounding the mosque. And in 1230, the local Ayyubid ruler Al-Mujahid Shirkuh, a nephew of the great Muslim general Saladin, built a magnificent castle on a hill overlooking the site. The Arab geographer Yaqut, who passed through Palmyra around that time, described Palmyra's residents as living in a castle surrounded by a stone wall. It continued to be occupied into the Ottoman era, and in the late 19th century, Fakhreddin ibn Ma'an, the local Ottoman governor, renovated the Crusader castle, preserving it into the present. In other words, the town of Tadmor was a vibrant living place long after the apex of its glory in the Roman era. All told, when we look at this history of Palmyra, we see a city that was under Roman influence, and which often rejected it, for about 300 years. The Temple of Bel, dedicated in 32 AD, functioned as a temple until it was destroyed and pillaged by the very Romans with whom the French associate the site, as a reprisal for the city's rebellion in 273. It was briefly rebuilt, but in the 4th century, with a gradual Christianization of the town, it ceased to function as a temple. This means that it served as a temple for around 240 years. As a church, for around 330 years. Following this, the Temple of Bel was, in fact, the Mosque of Tadmor for the majority of its history. In other words, it was a mosque for some 1,300 years. This should certainly make us wonder why we call it a temple at all. If this question seems unreasonable, consider that an identical history marks the story of the Great Mosque of Damascus and numerous other holy places converted after Muslims conquered the region. In fact, the dominant story of the Muslim conquest of the wealthy cities of Syria was one of reuse, not destruction. We would never, however, refer to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus primarily as a temple or a church, although we are aware of those prior histories. Because its function as a temple, as a mosque, was allowed to continue under colonial rule, it is still functioning today as the living heart of the city of Damascus. In other words, the Temple of Bel at Palmyra is a temple in our minds simply because the French created a temple. The Temple of Bel, then, is a product of the modern era and is the outcome of very modern forces of colonialism and population displacement, enacted to serve the needs and ends of French Europeans eager to burnish their nationalist credentials as guardians of the ancient European past, eager to style themselves as enlightened successors to the Roman Empire, as antiquarians, that had previously ruled Syria from Europe's shores. In other words, the site of Palmyra is not ancient, but modern, created between 1929 and 1932, when the French Mandate Director, Henri Seyrig, oversaw the demolishing of the town, of the mosque inside the temple, and the transferal of the town's residents from the living town of Palmyra to a new, modern town built on the boundary of the ancient site. The 1,300-year-old town of Islamic Tadmor, as well as its mosque, and this is the only known drawing of the mosque to have survived, was destroyed and cleared from the area, cleansed from memory as though it had never existed, and the process of recreation of the Temple of Bel was begun. So we might ask, what sort of town was Islamic Tadmor? What sort of place, locality, a home? What lives were lived there? Why did they choose to live within the environs of the temple precinct? Séri's Act 2 was a performance, an act of image breaking and image making, one no less powerful and no less generative of meaning, no less actively self-fashioning than Isis's hearkening back to an imagined caliphate. It was a European reanimation of a continent-crossing, cosmopolitan, imagined classical past. Instead of a caliphate, the French created a Roman-era site from a Christian and a living Islamic one. Instead of the revival of an imagined Islamic past, the French pursued the revival of a different, but no less idealized history. This process is, when we consider what it preserves and destroys selectively of that past, not so very different from Isis's ostensible desire to revive and enforce a return to an imagined time of purified monotheism. At Palmyra, then, we have two imaginings of the past, that of the French and that of Isis, but we also have two belief systems, contemporary heritage values and the values of contemporary revivalist Salafi movement. What we don't have is the story of the people who lived at Palmyra before these acts of destruction. Both of these acts brought destruction to the lifeways and historic integrity of the people of Palmyra. What is missing from this tale is an understanding of the value, the lived experience, and the imagining of antiquity embraced by the people of the village of Tadmor and by other Christian and Muslim inhabitants of the city over time. For it was this imaginary that was in every respect the very vision that enabled the site to survive until Séri's arrival in 1929. Indeed, long before the emergence of ISIS and other so-called Islamist iconoclasts, long before European explorers and archaeologists like Henri Séry arrived at sites like Palmyra, Muslims imagined Islamic and pre-Islamic antiquity and its localities in myriad and diverse ways, as sites of memory, spaces of healing, or places imbued with didactic, historical, and moral power. In 2017, I edited an issue of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture comprising 9 essays. The research in this volume reveals that the Islamic response to localities of antiquity is and always has been richly nuanced, varied, and context-dependent. It reveals a broadly pluralistic, multivalent range of Islamic responses to antiquity, responses not limited to notions of orthodoxy or orthopraxy. These responses emerged from a range of factors, including local tradition, the affective impact of and response to encountering localities of antiquity, and the historical, spiritual, and didactic significance of such localities for Muslim observers. This premise allows us to think more critically about the universal applicability of cosmopolitan heritage models like the one that justified the French destruction of the Islamic past at Palmyra, and argues for greater attention to and valuation of local and community-specific ways of encountering and embracing the past. Within this diversity, however, broad patterns emerge. The Islamic encounter with localities of antiquity can be grouped into a number of general categories. Here, I propose the following categories to frame these processes while not closing down the possibility for other interpretive framings, indeed hoping they might be expanded over the course of the next 2 days. Ajab, or wonder, ibar, or lessons, talismanic or apotropaic veneration or reuse, and sacred histories. Perhaps above all else, medieval and modern Muslims encountered localities of antiquity as sites of wonder, ajaib. The notion of ajab, or wonder, experienced as a visceral and sometimes sensorially overpowering feeling of astonishment and awe at the encounter of things that were strange, ancient, extraordinarily beautiful, or marvelous, had by about the 10th century developed into a distinct genre of literature called the ajaib. This genre had its roots in the geographical treatises of the ancient world and eventually came to include descriptions of wondrous ancient sites, natural phenomena, and strange flora and fauna, particularly those in far-off places. However, in its initial literary manifestation in the 10th century, the term appears in treatises describing the monuments and buildings of classical antiquity and of ancient Egypt, Persia, and Mesopotamia. A related genre of Arabic literature, the fada'il or praise treatises, arose simultaneously and focused on the excellence of things, places, people, qualities, and regions. A prominent subset of the fada'il literature was dedicated to the virtues of cities and provinces, whose excellence was often described as resting in their antiquity and in their possession of ancient monuments and works of art. The notion of ruins as sites of wonder was also a primary theme in pre-Islamic poetry within the oral tradition of the ancient Arabian Peninsula. In odes or qasidas from the pre-Islamic period, wonder is evoked primarily as a response to encountering ruins in the form of traces, atlal, of an encampment of one's beloved. The notion of wonder is also a prominent matter in the Quran, which emphasizes the marvels of God's creation and enjoins believers to encounter them with an attitude of wondrous admiration as a form of worship. Ajab later became an important epistemological framing for the justification of the making of art and the preservation of ruins. Indeed, a key theme within the Ajaib literature was the idea that the skills and arts of the ancient world were more advanced than those of the present. However, as Santi Kavuri Bauer has recently shown, Ajaib had deeper resonance from medieval observers, building on Aristotelian notions of astonishment and surprise as the first step toward gaining wisdom. Neoplatonic philosophers of the medieval era saw Ajaib as a manifestation of emanationist epistemologies, as a path to knowledge by means of observing God's signs in the material world. Perhaps no less prominent than the notion of wonder, and directly arising from it, is the concept of ibar, the lessons of history, powerfully evoked and contained within ruins and ancient sites. The idea that ancient sites and the stories they bear can serve as lessons of history is also found within the Quran, where in particular the story of Pharaoh was used as a cautionary tale about the perils of overweening vanity and arrogance. There, the passage of time, incumbent even on the greatest of men and creations, was meant to serve as a reminder of God's transcendence over the material world. As a result, Muslim philosophers, historians, and geographers gave ancient sites a prominent place within their writings, using them to indicate the futility of human efforts to transcend the passage of time. Ruins, ancient statues, paintings, and writings were, in this discourse, therefore important roles for consideration and contemplation on the place of humans within the cosmos. Ancient sites were also revered because they contained practical lessons. The scientific and technical knowledge of ancient builders, artists, and scientists were admired and emulated. Other monuments may have employed parts of ancient buildings or spolia as signs or lessons on the value of antiquity. For example, the Bimaristan or hospital of the great Zengid ruler Nuruddin in Damascus has an antique pediment reused on a lintel, supporting the cascading forms of a classically Islamic muqarnas half vault. This building appears to have reused spolia from the nearby ancient Roman temple of Jupiter, either for purely aesthetic reasons or for purposes of allusion to and propagandistic appropriation of the historical achievements of antiquity. Ancient sites were also cared for, venerated, and beloved because they were believed to have talismanic or apotropaic properties. These practices of powerful selective reuse and appropriation often carried on beliefs and understandings granted to them in Byzantine or earlier times. At the heart of Istanbul, for example, a famous serpent column with 3 heads made of bronze was placed on the site of the former hippodrome in the 4th century BCE and nearby other ancient and Byzantine monuments, including an Egyptian obelisk originally made for Thutmose III in the 15th century. The sculpture was valued by Muslims from the medieval period onward and is mentioned in geographical treatises and city descriptions as early as the 10th century. The Serpent Column was an ancient Greek votive offering taken from the most important Greek ritual site, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Originally brought by the Christian Roman emperor as a symbol of his universal rule, by the late Byzantine era and well into Ottoman times, it was revered as an apotropaic talisman believed to protect the city from poisonous snakes. In the Wakala or caravanserai of Qawsun in Cairo has a reused threshold slab with ancient hieroglyphics dating to the era of the pharaoh Ramses II, still intact. The hieroglyphics could easily have been removed by an iconoclast over 5 centuries since the mosque was built, or it could have been installed in such a way that the hieroglyphics could not be visible. This presentation began with Palmyra, a site that reveals how Muslims esteemed and frequently reused holy sites like temples, shrines, and churches, both because of the inherent sacredness that adhered to them and because their antiquity was an important heritage value. But Muslims also valued objects of antiquity for their ability to serve as signs of a holy person's presence in a particular locality. Between the 11th and 13th centuries in Syria, such sites proliferated, frequently following the appearance of a holy figure in a dream, who would often indicate an ancient inscribed stone as proof of a long-lost holy site. Such was the case with the medieval Mashhad al-Muhassin, a shrine to the lost grandson of al-Hussein that was revealed in a dream to the ruler of Aleppo, Saif ad-Dawla, in the 10th century. In the dream, Saif ad-Dawla saw lights descending on the Jebel Jawshan outside of Aleppo, and when he went to the site and began to dig, he revealed a sacred stone that indicated the site's antiquity. A shrine was subsequently built on the site. As I have argued elsewhere, such sites are associated with the inscription of antiquity and history on the land during the 11th through 13th centuries, forming a notion of Islamic sacred landscape that is deeply embedded in and reificatory of the material connection of Islam to the past, a landscape that rooted Muslims in historical and religious time. In this paper, I wish to make an argument for valuing distinct, multivalent, and local Islamic responses to the material past, and for evoking the consistent presence of a rich discursive world around diverse notions of the importance of antiquity in Islamic societies. In doing so, we both reveal the diverse ways Muslims engaged with antiquity in the past and in the present, and also reveal the contours of a distinctly Islamic notion of heritage that emphasizes the limits of the cosmopolitan heritage goals advanced by many contemporary international heritage organizations. In some places, as at Palmyra, these same cosmopolitan goals can be both protective, as they were under the care of archaeologists like Khalid al-Assad and the many other Syrian heritage workers in the Islamic world, or destructive of heritage, whether through biases against Muslim ways of engaging with the material past, as in the case with Henri Seyrig, or by inadvertently providing encouragement to the destructive impulses of groups like ISIS. I argue that any kind of discourse about antiquarianism and heritage that is rooted in local Islamic ways of valuing and imagining the localities of antiquity must be part of any future engagement with ancient sites in the Islamic world, and it is only then that heritage discourse will become truly cosmopolitan. Thank you.